Hello there, welcome to the channel, it's Nerdworld Empire. Today, continuing our series on races from Star Trek that are not as fully explored or as well understood as we would like them to be, and this episode is on the Nacene, more commonly known as the Caretakers. This is the species who one of their members was responsible for the abduction and stranding of the USS Voyager in the Delta Quadrant over 70,000 light years from its original location. Before we get started breaking down what we know about this intergalactic power, like, share, subscribe, comment down below your opinions and thoughts. And let's get started. The Nacene, as I said, were an extremely advanced non-humanoid species who were described as being sporocystian in nature. Which, just the reference to the word spore does automatically evoke, at least in my mind, the thought of, where are these guys from? Because we now know that there is another basic dimension sitting on top of ours, and these things ain't exactly like us. For a start, biologically, if you can call them biological, their bodies, at least superficially, unless they were technologically aided, seem to defy gravity. Their physical appearance has no appendages. It's an amorphous blob that glows and sort of emanates more energy when it seems to talk, indicating that it's not talking psychically, that it's actually talking verbally, and is somehow vibrating air molecules to create sound, just differently to how we do. When it dies, the creature shrivels up into some kind of quartz-like crystalline rock, which is known to vibrate when in proximity to another member of its own kind, or at least possibly some of their technology. How this race build arrays like the Caretakers array isn't entirely clear, and although they seem to exist in an M-class environment, it's not known if they could exist in other environmental forms. But it would seem that the gravity aboard the Caretakers array was similar to that aboard a Federation starship. It would seem that although they were very different biologically, at least on a technological level, albeit a much more advanced one than that of the Federation and humanity of the 24th century, was similar, at least in its base origins, to our own, and in its fundamental operations. We don't know much about their starships in and of themselves, but their vessels were certainly capable of intergalactic travel, not just interplanetary. This race travelled across the Milky Way galaxy, conducting scientific experiments and expanding their knowledge, much like Starfleet, something that Janeway clearly identified with, and I think we all could, really. This race would come across a planet in an area of the Delta Quadrant we would now know to be the Ocampan homeworld. At the time, the Nacene didn't think much of it and began performing experiments on the planet's atmosphere. Unbeknownst to them, their incredibly advanced technology would be destructive to this planet, rendering it virtually incapable of supporting life, or at least having liquid water on the surface. This basically created a genocide amongst the Ocampa. The Nacene, not being malevolent entities, but also not being omnipotent, were not able to completely fix the problem, although they did attempt to do so. Realizing they couldn't fix it and transplant such a large population of Ocampa, which would have probably made more sense than doing what they did, they decided, they got a couple of volunteers, shall we say, to stay behind and look after the Ocampa, who they would baby to the point where the Ocampa practically couldn't stand on their own at the end of it. The Nacene probably would have been better off, in my humble opinion, in simply moving the Ocampa to another M-class world and explaining it away as, oops, our mistake, I know it's terrible, but it's either this or you die, we're very sorry. It could have been they didn't want to interact with them, they may not have had the time or the resources to move their population, they may have been trying to simply save as many of them as possible. We don't know what the Ocampan population was at the time of this disaster, but it wasn't exactly vast when Voyager encountered them in 2371. The Caretaker by this point was dying. We know that the Caretakers have two genders, male and female, and they left one of each behind. This may not have been with the intention of them procreating from the other's point of view, but nonetheless, that was a possibility. However, Suspiria, the other Caretaker, left. getting bored of their endless vigil and looking after the Okampa, although she did what the other Nacene should have done in the first place, and took some of the Okampa with her, and created a system colony of them out in space on a smaller version of the larger array created to watch over the Okampa. We do know that their technology was extremely formidable. They were not biologically compatible with other races, so despite their best efforts, the Caretaker, when he was dying to reproduce, he was not able to force that to happen with anyone, which was pretty diabolical when we're really meant to be being sympathetic to this person, and you really analyse what the hell he was doing. But anyway, moving on from that, their technology, as stated, was extremely advanced. How they moved around space is not known, but it may have been the same way they moved Voyager from the Alpha to the Delta Quadrant. Near instantaneous travel over vast distances seemed to be, although complicated to do and power consuming according to the Caretaker, it was clearly a relatively easy, almost mundane thing, almost the equivalent of Janeway hopping in a shuttle and visiting down to a planet and coming back up. Yeah, it's a little inconvenient, it requires pushing a few buttons, actually focusing on what you're doing and driving, but it wasn't that difficult for them to lob a ship tens of thousands of light years, so we can only imagine what the capabilities of that technology were. Seemingly, as it wasn't hard to pull a vessel from that distance, it wouldn't have been hard to go even further, although its exact range is unknown. It's also plausible that they used some kind of warp technology, but let me know in the comments below if you have any alternative theories as to how they got around. Maybe spore drive, for example. The race culturally were scientifically orientated, and although their technology was destructive, it wasn't intended to be so, and they did attempt to correct their mistakes, feeling guilt collectively as a people and on an individual level for what they did to the Okampa, and not wanting to affect the balance of power. Although he didn't judge the Kazon necessarily for who and what they were, he knew that he couldn't allow his technology to fall into the hands of the Kazon, and attempted to destroy the array when he was dying and had failed to produce an heir to look after his array in his stead. Their race were extremely long-lived, which did bring me to my thought when I first watched it. With all their technology and all of his abilities, clearly their race wanted to look after the Okampa. If he was dying, why didn't he just phone home and say, you know, guys, it's time for me to retire. I'm dying here. Can you send out a replacement? Why did it have to be a lifelong commitment unless it was his moral decision to do so and wasn't necessarily a decision actually made by the others, simply condoned and authorized? It's like, right, fine, you can build a big space station, you can look after them, you can give them food and power and guide them, but this isn't a decision that the government is making. This is your personal one. If you choose to commit yourself to that life, then that's fine. Suspiria, his mate, she stays with him, gets bored, leaves him and buggers off, but maybe can't get home. Maybe the limitations of the resources they had to hand meant she couldn't get back, but she was able to build a new array somehow and live there, also looking after the Okampa. There's a lot of flaws in this, and I think the complexity of understanding a very alien mind here is probably where I'm running into a wall. But nonetheless, that is the Nacene. This is of course only covering the primary first contact and primary sources that Starfleet has for the Nacene, not any alternate universe divergent timelines we see from eras such as 2409. So with that said, that covers broadly the Nacene. We can only take educated guesses at what some of their other technology was capable of. We saw that they were able to bat Voyager away several days away from the station at maximum warp with relative ease. They pulled dozens, perhaps hundreds of ships from across the galaxy, again with ease. The station's defensive capabilities were not capable of withstanding, at least when they weren't active, on any level, Tricobalt device attack from Voyager or the collision of a Kazon carrier into the array, but nonetheless, although the technology was clearly not impervious, it was extremely advanced, and likely, as this was not a military installation, the race were capable of far greater military action than what we saw, but they don't seem to be a hostile race, so it's not clear if they even had a military. Again, we can only really guess, so these are just my sort of afterthoughts and observations, really, which are not confirmed by any primary sources in reference to the Nacene. They certainly have an aggressive streak, but seem to be an honourable race, overall, with no bad intentions towards others, despite dragging ships from all over the galaxy just to, yes, save one people. Yes, I'll sacrifice a few crews, that's fine. I will drag dozens of ships filled with countless unknown aliens across the galaxy, perform medical experiments all on them, all with the intention of then probably imprisoning them to mate with them in some way, which is kind of a creepy thought, impregnate them forcibly against their will to bear me a child to take over what I am doing. Again, there is some moral grey area here. Clearly he must have tried this with the Okompa first, was not capable of doing it, and then started with, I'm assuming, local races in the Delta Quadrant before extending his search to be much wider afield, because it would have made sense to start with races like the Kazon and other such species who were relatively close, or even maybe just grab a Borg cube and, well, you've got dozens of different species on board. I can have my time of my life here, but they might not have, intact reproductive organs. Anyway. All the same, I assume cloning wasn't an option, as their species seemed to be, although certainly corporeal, there seemed to be an energy component, but cloning may have been an option. He just couldn't explore it, didn't have the resources, and maybe they're not capable of being cloned. There are a lot of avenues to go down that I can only assume that the Caretaker explored before resorting to extreme measures to ensure the survival of the Okompans. But again, what do you think in the comments below? That is all that we have, plus a few of my thoughts on the Nacene. And we're now at the end of this video. I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others. And also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.